Welcome and thanks so much for joining us. I'm just going to wait about 60 seconds so we can let some of our colleagues join us. So please sit tight. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted to say that we have over 200 of you joining this vital conversation about the endangerment finding, defending a cornerstone of climate policy. I'm Ann Kelly, Vice President of Government Relations at Ceres, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you and all of our guests for what is going to be a dynamite hour, so hold on to your seats. We managed to get the real experts on this topic for today's conversation. We're also recording today's webinar, so know that you'll receive a link and you'll have all the slides that we're going over. And let's go right to our next slide so I can walk you through the agenda. I'm honored to have Gina McCarthy with us for a fireside chat. And you all know Gina's background with regard to the EPA. We're then going to talk with Michael Gerard, who is the standout legal expert from the Columbia Law School Sabin Center, about the legal implications of the proposed revocation of the endangerment finding and what that means. We're then going to talk about how to frame endangerment, and I'm honored to have Will Howard here from the Potential Energy Coalition, who has some poll-tested language from independents and Republicans and Democrats from across the country. I think you're going to be pleased to hear just how much the public is with us on the need for EPA to actually do its job. Then we're going to go over how you all can get involved, which is the real reason for this session, what it is you need to do. And we're going to hear finally from two corporate leaders, Kara Fulcher of Michelin and Lloyd Cass from Franklin Energy, who are going to let you know to step in. The water is fine. This is a moment for corporate climate leadership like no other. We also want to answer your questions. Know that the chat function is not on for this particular webinar, but the Q&A function is. So by all means, put your questions in the Q&A. We will endeavor to answer all of them in real time. If we can't answer them in real time, we will answer them after this session. We want to hear from you. By the end of this session, we want to make sure all of your legal and political questions have been answered and that you feel comfortable to engage in leadership at this moment in defense of the EPA endangerment finding. So yes, this is a webinar with a full, clear agenda. And now let's go to our next slide. It is my great honor to introduce Ceres' very good friend, Gina McCarthy. She was the first ever White House National Climate Advisor to President Biden. And as you know, she was former EPA administrator under President Obama. She has been a climate champion for a long time and continues in this movement. Gina, thank you so much for being with us today.
And it's always my pleasure to be here with you and the folks at Ceres. It's a wonderful opportunity, I think, for me and for all of us to understand a little bit better what's going on. And certainly, I'm thanking all the business folks that have attended because I think there's a lot at risk and a lot of opportunity ahead, and we want to capture those opportunities.
Absolutely. Well, Gene, take us back a little bit. I mean, you led the EPA during a pivotal time for climate policy, and I'm wondering if you can go back to that experience and speak a little bit about how the endangerment finding shaped your approach to regulating greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act.
Well, and I think you and folks on the phone or on the call are aware that it really was all about the endangerment finding. That was the clear issue that EPA had to look at because it became increasingly understandable, I think, to us and to the scientific community, that climate change was simply worsening. We knew we had a threat that needed to be addressed. And in order to address that under EPA's rulemaking, we had to do an endangerment finding. And for those of you who may not know it, in short, the endangerment finding is a prerequisite for regulating in certain portions of the Clean Air Act. And so, in order to move forward to look at how we would address climate change, we had to do the endangerment finding. In the endangerment finding, honestly, I was at EPA at the time when we did this rule. I mean, when we did the endangerment finding, it was a huge scientific opportunity to pull together experts from across the government, not just at EPA, to look at what climate change was doing, how we could properly characterize that in terms of the threat it posed to health and welfare, because that's what an endangerment finding looks like. And thankfully, we had a wealth of scientists who worked together day and night to actually address this challenge and pull together the endangerment finding. And like the system requires, we put it out for comment, we take a look at it, we make decisions. And in this instance, US EPA was convinced that the science was robust, that we had to take action on climate change through the regulatory process. And that's how it began. But honestly, I think you know as well, and many of others do, that this discussion about climate didn't begin at EPA. It began at the states and local communities who were seeing the challenges, and EPA simply responded to the need to do its job, which is protect health and well-being. And that's what we did. And as a result, we were able to then regulate, and those regulations have been hugely important, not just domestically, but internationally, to show the ways in which we could work with the business community, work with the faith community, work with all of the folks that cared about this issue, and we were able to pull that together and continue to move forward then to address greenhouse gas emissions directly.
Absolutely. Thank you. And as Michael will describe, the endangerment finding, of course, is based on the 2007 Supreme Court case, Massachusetts versus EPA.
Yeah.
But Gina, can you say a little bit more then about what do you think the implications are if EPA goes forward and revokes the endangerment finding?
Well, yeah, there's a huge implication here. I think, as all of us in this call already know, the endangerment finding was required. Um, uh, I'm sorry. The endangerment finding was a prerequisite to regulation. So what the EPA is trying to do now is to basically take away the endangerment finding that the earlier EPA had believed to be absolutely comprehensive in terms of its understanding of the impact on our health and well-being. And instead, they're looking at getting rid of the endangerment finding. And the challenge that we have here is that the repeal of the endangerment finding would mean that we can no longer regulate greenhouse gas emissions, period, in any sector of the economy. And that's going to present huge challenges. And I think people, when they start thinking about this, will understand it. It is going to mean that if the federal government doesn't do its job and address the challenge of climate change, which is visible, which is already creating such extreme damage in so many states and threats to human life. If we can't figure out how to address that at the federal level, you're going to see states and you're going to see cities jumping in. You're going to see NGOs and others who care about their communities jumping on businesses who may not be actually continuing to do the job they would have done if we were regulating greenhouse gas emissions. So this is going to be a really a threat to every level of government and a challenge to every level of government to understand both the problem and what are the solutions and legal solutions we have available to us to keep making progress moving forward. But I think the most things that it disturbs me is actually what it will do to the business community. I mean, we are talking about, basically every business is now going to have to figure out what they stand for, how they can make sure that they're meeting their commitments that they've already made in ways that are going to keep them safe and help the air quality of their communities and the impacts. And it's going to be testing all of us. And I think it's not the prettiest picture to have states and individual communities, and cities taking action, rather than seeing the federal government do it in a way where everybody is going to be treated equally. Everybody's going to understand their obligation. Everybody is going to have to show that they're doing the right thing together. So it's going to be a very difficult time, and I don't relish that opportunity to start again with a new endangerment finding under a new administration. But if that's what it's going to take, that's what we got to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're getting at my next question, Gina, with that last answer. But what do you think this kind of message sends in terms of policy certainty to companies going,
Yeah.
right? And
Well,
you hint at kind of a patchwork.
it is, and that's exactly what we're going to see. And the most disturbing part of this is that, Administrator Zeldin came out and he made this some kind of an economic argument, like regulating greenhouse gas emissions was somehow taking down the economy. Look, if you want to know where the economy is doing well, it's the clean energy economy. You know what I mean? And you're sitting there shaking your head saying EPA is by on its own initiative taking away its own authority. It's bizarre, the world we're living in. But the interesting thing is that I think we all know that the business community is continuing to thrive if they're investing in clean energy, because it is our future and we are moving forward. And I don't think this is going to change that, because I think communities expect their businesses to stand up, and their businesses need to be smart. It doesn't mean they need to raise their hand and start touting all the great things they're doing, but it does mean that those great things they're doing need to continue, because we have to make sure that we're protecting our people. We have to make sure that we're facing the challenge, the biggest challenge of all of our lifetimes, which is the challenge of climate change. And it's embarrassing for the United States, who is the second largest emitter in the world, pretending like greenhouse gas emissions isn't a problem for us. It's really disturbing, I think, for all of us who have been doing work for so long at the federal and state level. But it's going to be a lot up to states, a lot up to cities, and a whole lot up to the business community. And I don't think that's necessarily the best way for us to handle all these things, for sure, but we'll have to live through them and figure out how to work together. I know businesses are working hard and I know they can do it. And I think one of the reasons Ceres is around is to help them figure out how to navigate a problem. But this is the biggest challenge that I think all of us will face in that regard.
Well, you're so right, Gina. And the folks on this call are the ones who have set science-based targets. They've set climate goals. They've already invested in climate action over several years, sometimes decades. I'm wondering what your advice would be to them. What would you imagine would be useful for businesses and investors now who want to push back, weigh in, take a stand to see that this doesn't happen?
I think what happened before, as we were working on the endangerment finding and subsequent regulations, is that we got the businesses to stand together. And I don't think people realize that, but we did. We didn't push them beyond what they could actually deal with in terms of a regulatory action. But we brought them together and we made them understand, and they made us understand that we had to work together on this issue. And so I don't think businesses should be shy about indicating that they understand the challenge of climate change and what they can do to help contribute to the solutions. And so keep working together. That would be my best effort at understanding how they can sort of not be afraid to stand up. But I do think collaboration is going to be necessary. And I do think it's absolutely essential to look at the real benefits of continuing to move forward. If you look at the regulatory impact analysis, which is a coin of phrase, but it's necessary. If you look at what they're discussing in the endangerment finding from this administration now, is they've actually designed a strategy that costs businesses money. They designed a strategy that costs consumers money. We're talking about raising fuel prices. We're talking about reducing our labor force. So they're doing nothing to benefit businesses or individuals or families or communities with this crazy endangerment finding. What we have to do is work together to talk about the science, to talk about how we can benefit one another, to stand tall together, and to keep doing what we've always done. And that is work together.
Wow. Well, I couldn't imagine a better pitch than that. I know, having heard Gina, many of you are dying now to sign on to our letter. I'm going to ask Jackie to pop it right into the chat, because you can do that, because comment letters are quite important to EPA, are they not, Gina? I mean, they make a big difference.
They're vital. That's where the rubber will meet the road, folks. Actually signing on to a letter to just express your interest in this is hugely important. It means everything. It gives this administration a sense that maybe I just went a little too far. Maybe there's other ways in which we can move our economy forward, really move it forward, and actually protect our business interests. That's what this is all about. This is not about sacrifice. This is all about working together for the benefit of all of us.
You're so right, Gina. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for underscoring the need for collaboration, because that's exactly right. We work together here, and when we collaborate, we can really have an impact. Thank you for staying in this game, Gina, all these years. We owe you. Thanks for being with us today. We will be in touch.
Take care. Thank you.
All right. Well, now, after that wonderful, inspiring talk from Gina, I'm thrilled to introduce our good friend, Michael Gerard. Michael is founder and faculty director of the Saban Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, and there is simply no one better to walk us through the legal thickets around the endangerment finding, its implications, and its history. A warm welcome to you, Michael.
And thanks so much for having me.
And away.
So if we could go to, I'm just going to jump into the legal issues here. So if we go to the next slide. This is where the endangerment finding comes from. The Section 202A1 of the Clean Air Act says that the EPA administrator shall issue regulations for new motor vehicles, which in a judgment, which emit air pollution that cause or contribute to air pollution that endangers public health or welfare. And so this is why we need an endangerment finding. And if there is an endangerment finding, regulations are necessary. We see in 302G that air pollutant is very broadly defined. And we see in 302H the definition of welfare, which is one of the bases for the endangerment finding. It includes weather, visibility, and climate. So the George W. Bush administration was refusing to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles. They were challenged in court by Massachusetts and others, and that led to the Massachusetts versus the EPA decision. Next slide. And in that decision in 2007, the Supreme Court said, yeah, greenhouse gases certainly fit within the definition of air pollution. And although EPA is refusing to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, they haven't explained why. So it's up to them to either issue an endangerment finding or explain why not. In the balance of the Bush administration, they didn't do much. But as soon as Obama came in, the first EPA administrator, Lisa Jackson, got to work. Next slide. And her large team. And in December of 2009, they issued the endangerment finding. And so there are two findings that are actually necessary. One is that there's endangerment, and the other is that by these pollutants, and the other is that these pollutants cause or contribute to negative effects. So the endangerment finding found that these listed air pollutants cause a threat to public health and welfare, and that emissions from motor vehicles cause or contribute to this negative effect. Next slide. Once the endangerment finding was in effect, EPA was able to start regulating greenhouse gases. They issued a series of regulations, some of them concerning cars and trucks, the tailpipe rule, and the standards for medium and heavy duty engines and vehicles. There was also an EPA regulation that said that EPA needs to regulate for stationary sources, for power plants and factories, any pollutants that are regulated. Greenhouse gases were now regulated for motor vehicles, which meant they were also regulated for stationary sources. EPA later issued some additional endangerment findings, but this got them started. They issued these important regulations on emissions from both mobile and stationary sources. Next slide. There was a whole slew of lawsuits challenging the endangerment finding and the regulations and other things EPA was doing. I think there were more than 100 lawsuits. They were all brought together in the DC Circuit in a case called Coalition for Responsible Regulation versus EPA. In that lawsuit, some of the plaintiffs, the industries and red states that were suing, raised the scientific issues. The DC Circuit would have none of it. The DC Circuit found that there was ample information in the record that EPA had to support its greenhouse gas emissions, and that the regulation was consistent with the Massachusetts versus EPA decision. So the DC Circuit basically upheld everything EPA was doing, the endangerment finding and the other regulations. Next slide. Several things happened after that. That case went up to the Supreme Court in a case called Utility Air Regulatory Group versus EPA. Supreme Court didn't want to touch the endangerment finding. They weren't interested in looking at that. They upheld most of what EPA was doing. They struck down a very small portion of regulation of stationary sources, but most things were left standing. In October of 2014, EPA under President Obama issued the Clean Power Plan aimed at reducing greenhouse gases from fossil fuel-fired power plants, mostly coal plants. To everyone's shock, in February of 2016, the Supreme Court stayed the Clean Power Plan. They put it on hold in a one-paragraph decision that didn't explain the reasoning, but they put a halt to the Clean Power Plan. That was challenged in, there was then ongoing litigation, but Donald Trump won. He had pledged to repeal the Clean Power Plan. EPA did repeal the Clean Power Plan in June of 2019. And then in June of 2022, the Supreme Court issued its very important decision, West Virginia versus EPA, saying that EPA didn't have the authority to issue the Clean Power Plan because Congress had not been explicit enough in giving EPA the authority under the Clean Air Act to do that. They declared something called the Major Questions Doctrine, and they said the Clean Power Plan was beyond EPA's authority. As soon as President Biden came in, EPA came to work and they issued new standards for power plants that were much different from what the Clean Power Plan had been. After President Trump came back, Congress used the Congressional Review Act to nullify the California waiver, which is a provision where ordinarily there is federal preemption of motor vehicle standards, but EPA can grant a waiver to California to allow it to have stronger standards. And if California gets the waiver, then other states can follow the California standards. Traditionally, states that together represent about 40% of the motor vehicle market signed on to the California standards, but Congress nullified that in May. And in June, as we all know, EPA proposed to revoke the endangerment finding and the motor vehicle standards. Next slide. So when Administrator Zeldin announced that he was proposing to repeal the endangerment finding, he used what I call a cluster bomb approach. He threw out a lot of different theories in the hopes that at least one of them would stick. They don't all have to stick. Any one of them could be sufficient. So first they put forward a number of what I call climate minimizing scientists who say that climate change is happening, but it's not so bad. And therefore, greenhouse gases aren't such a big problem that they warrant an endangerment finding. That was one theory. And, you know, a lot of scientific evidence is right now being mustered on the other side. They also argue that the Clean Air Act applies only to local and regional problems and not to a global problem like climate change. They brought up the major questions doctrine that came up in the West Virginia case, saying that EPA didn't have explicit enough congressional authorization to do any of this. And finally, they decided to slice and dice the pollutants, saying that you need to consider each pollutant separately, carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide and so forth. And then you need to consider each kind of source separately, motor vehicles, power plants, and so forth. And EPA would need to show that each chunk itself had a measurable impact on climate change. So those are their main theories that they're putting forth. Next slide. In terms of what's coming next, there are some public hearings coming up in August. The comment period closes on September 15th. There will be probably thousands of comments, and EPA is going to have to respond to each substantive comment. They just can't say, we don't believe it. They need to respond to each substantive comment, because if they don't, then that's very vulnerable to being struck down in court. That'll take them a while. So I don't expect that the final rule will come out with the responses to the comments until sometime next year, sometime in 2026. There will immediately be numerous lawsuits filed against EPA for doing that. They will go to the DC Circuit. In the ordinary course, it would take the DC Circuit some time. They get the case. There's briefing from both sides, and reply briefs and amicus briefs come in. Then there's argument. Then they have to write the decision. And so in the ordinary course, we wouldn't expect a decision from the DC Circuit until probably 2027. Whoever loses in the DC Circuit will probably petition the Supreme Court to take the case. I think there's a decent chance that the Supreme Court will agree to take the case. And so I think that might happen within a few months after the DC Circuit decision. Then there's briefing, of course, an argument in the Supreme Court, and they have to write their decision. So in the ordinary course, we probably wouldn't see a final decision from the Supreme Court until 2028. Now, it might happen sooner than that. The Supreme Court, as we saw, put a stay on the Clean Power Plan very quickly without briefing, really, with almost none. So they could jump in faster. But in the ordinary course, we probably wouldn't see a decision from the Supreme Court until 2028. And of course, that's an election year, and who knows what happens after that. Next slide. So if the Supreme Court does take the case, I think there's several different possible things that could happen. And here I'm going to array from the best case scenario from an environmental perspective to the worst case scenario. Best case scenario is they vacate the revocation. They say EPA could not revocate, it cannot revoke the endangerment finding. That would be great. That's the best case scenario. Another possibility is the DC Circuit has invalidated the endangerment finding, and the Supreme Court just doesn't take the case. They leave the DC Circuit standing. The decision by the DC Circuit annulling the revocation, if that's what happens, they leave it standing. The Supreme Court could find that the EPA made some mistakes in the way that it revoked the endangerment finding, and they could send it back to EPA for more work. And if they do that, they could either issue something called vacatur, which means that it would be annulling the revocation and the endangerment finding would be back in effect, or they could remand without vacatur, which means that the endangerment finding is still in effect while the EPA rethinks it. The next possibility is that the Supreme Court could uphold the revocation of the endangerment finding on fairly narrow grounds, on grounds that might be fixable down the road. Maybe EPA made a procedural mistake. Maybe there were other issues that supported the revocation, but not taking away EPA's power. And the worst case scenario is that the Supreme Court upholds the revocation of the endangerment finding and does it in a way where they say EPA did not have the power under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. They could reverse the Massachusetts versus EPA decision, or without overtly reversing it, they could read it very narrowly. And if that happens, that really means that the next president, if there's a differently inclined president, and that person's EPA would not have the ability to bring back the endangerment finding and bring back this regulation. So this is the sort of range of options that I think are imaginable. Next slide. So the revocation of the endangerment finding, as Gina McCarthy said, would block EPA from using the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. Would block it from using it to regulate greenhouse gases from motor vehicles and ships and aircraft and power plants and other industrial facilities and oil and gas operations. They just couldn't use the Clean Air Act. However, there are a lot of things that would not be affected by the revocation of the endangerment finding. Next slide. So the revocation of the endangerment finding would not block the other tools that EPA has to regulate sources of greenhouse gases, because most sources of greenhouse gases emit not only greenhouse gases, but other pollutants. They regulate other, they emit other air pollutants. They emit sulfur dioxide and particulates and lots of other things. EPA could still regulate those. Coal-fired power plants generate a lot of ash. That can be regulated under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. They heat up the water, certain kinds of power plants. That could be regulated under the Clean Water Act. So there are a number of authorities that EPA has that would still stand. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, under a separate statute, regulates vehicle fuel economy standards. That would not be affected by the revocation of the endangerment finding. Federal government and state government can still use their procurement power. If they decide they're only going to buy electric vehicles, they can do that. They don't need the endangerment finding for that. State regulation is not preempted. Motor vehicles are an exception, but in every other respect, the Clean Air Act says that the federal standards are the floor, not the ceiling. And so states can regulate beyond what EPA does. And that's one of the things that could lead to this patchwork, where instead of one set of EPA regulations, we have lots of different states regulating in their own way to their own extent. The revocation of the endangerment finding would not prevent Congress or anybody else from providing subsidies or incentives for wind and solar. If Congress were to want to bring back the subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act that have been pared back, it could do that. It wouldn't get in the way of that. The endangerment finding revocation would not at all affect energy efficiency measures. Those are done by the Department of Energy under an entirely different statute that doesn't rely on the endangerment finding. States and local governments still have a lot of authority over, the power plants that are within their jurisdiction, over zoning and building codes, transportation systems, and lots of other things. Congress in the future can do whatever it wants, even if we have a worst case scenario that could be reversed by a future Congress. The revocation of the endangerment finding would not block voluntary efforts by motor vehicle manufacturers. to the extent that the manufacturers want to continue producing electric vehicles, that this would not at all stand in the way. There's an argument that states would still be able to would be able to issue their own motor vehicle standards if the endangerment finding is all gone. I'm not going to give an opinion on that, but there's an argument that we may see pop up. Next slide. My final slide is if the endangerment finding goes away, it's possible that that would revive certain kinds of litigation that have been brought against the fossil fuel companies. There have been more than 30 lawsuits brought mostly by states and cities against fossil fuel companies. The first ones were brought using the federal common law of nuisance. In 2011, in the American Electric Power versus Connecticut case, the Supreme Court ruled the federal common law of nuisance cannot be used against greenhouse gas emissions because the Clean Air Act gives EPA the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. And so because of that decision, a lot of lawsuits were brought in state courts using state common law of nuisance and some other theories. Several of these lawsuits are still pending. And one of the major defenses that the fossil fuel companies are raising is that because EPA can regulate greenhouse gases, this 2011 decision applies, and the state litigation is preempted. If EPA can no longer regulate greenhouse gases because of the revocation of the endangerment finding, and particularly if we have our worst case Supreme Court scenario, then that defense probably goes away. And it's possible that we'll see new lawsuits filed in federal court, in addition to the lawsuits we have in state court. And the lawsuits in state court may be limited by the jurisdiction they have, but in federal courts are not so limited. So that is my summary of the legal situation. And back to Anne.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. This is incredibly helpful. And thank you for highlighting the old Clean Power Plan. We had 600 companies behind it. One question that's come up, several questions have come up in Q&A, but we only have time for one, which is going to be, can you just comment on the legal implications for companies who might sign on to our letter? Should there be any concerns about those who join a collaborative letter that's basically going to become a comment in the comment file for the administrative record for the future cases?
No, I don't see any legal risks to companies in signing on. You know, it's very common that lots of parties sign on to comment letters of various kinds, and there aren't legal consequences. I can't speak to the political consequences, but the legal, I don't see I don't see any legal consequences to signing the letter, any adverse effect on the companies.
Thank you. And then very quickly, you kind of implied this, but I want you to just answer the question that I know is on people's minds, which is if in your worst case scenario, that last bullet on your slide, what would it take for a future administration to reinstate the endangerment finding, and would they be able to do that?
I think under the worst case scenario, which uses the major questions doctrine, we would need new action by Congress in order to reinstate the endangerment finding or to come up with a new plan using the Clean Air Act.
Well, thank you, and no easy task. Thank you so much, Michael. There are more questions popping up in the Q&A. If you're able to stay on, we'd love it. And if you can answer any of those in real time, thank you so much. We are going to move on. That was incredibly helpful analysis. And again, you will have the slides and the link to this webinar. And I'm thrilled to introduce Will Howard. Will is head of Insights and Advocacy Services at Potential Energy Coalition. Will, we're anxious to hear what you have to tell us today about the politics of the situation. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. And for time, I will dive straight in. I'll just say quickly that in my role as head of Insights and Advisory Services at Potential Energy, one of my primary roles is conducting a great deal of messaging-focused research. I used to work in the corporate sector with kind of Fortune 100 companies working on issues related to framing and word choice. And I now do a lot of the same work looking at how to most effectively talk about a range of climate and clean energy related topics with Potential Energy, which is a nonprofit very much focused on exploring those exact territories. So I'm going to move through these pretty quickly, but I just wanted to highlight, we conducted a survey a couple weeks ago now, really focused on how to talk about this topic, trying to understand how people felt about the upcoming action or the potential for an upcoming action, and looking at some of the most effective ways to talk about it in that context. So I'll move through these, go to the next slide. Just a quick note that we are a C3 organization, so if you have any desire to use any of our data, please make sure you consult with us to ensure it's fair use. As we move through here to the next slide, we conducted a survey that I'll be referencing throughout here. All the data you see in here is referencing this survey, which is a US-specific survey. It's around 1,600 people, all of them kind of a representative mix of the US population. We had a fairly simple survey instrument design where everyone had a very similar survey experience, but we did split them into two cells that tested, so kind of half and half to 800-person samples. Each one saw a slightly different framing of the EPA action itself, that kind of a different context setting description of what was happening, just to test a couple of variables about how to talk about the endangerment finding itself, and you'll see that covered in a moment. But overall, our goals were to understand what is the kind of baseline level of knowledge of the role of the EPA, the role of the endangerment finding itself in the EPA's larger function, and how much kind of broad support is there for the activities that the EPA undertakes today within the parameters of the endangerment finding as far as protecting against greenhouse gases and climate change, and what would the attitudes or the perceptions be towards a potential action like this. And we also looked at a range of kind of arguments for and against this upcoming there's potential revocation of the endangerment finding to see how people might react to it, or how people would evaluate those arguments as relatively persuasive or not so persuasive. So we'll move through to the next slide. I pulled out 7 main takeaways for you all here. Not all of these are going to be the most relevant for, or not all of these will be directly applicable for a corporate communicator, but they do helpfully provide some valuable context to understand where the everyday person is coming from on this topic. And then I do think there are a couple nuggets in here that I'll highlight as we go through that I think are hopefully thought-provoking as you think about how your own organization might talk about this topic right now. So we'll move through them. The first thing I'll just say quickly is that absolutely no one today has heard of or understands the endangerment finding. As a closed-end multiple choice, 60% of people said they had no idea what the endangerment finding was. 20% said they thought they knew what it was. 20% were actually so bold as to say they were confident they knew what it was. But then they went and guessed things like the things that you see at the bottom of this slide, where they think it's about endangered species or danger more broadly and vaguely. When we actually evaluated the open-ended answers that we got, only around 1 in 10 people was guessing anywhere close to the correct definition. And I wouldn't rule out the possibility that they'd maybe Googled to get there. So it's a very low level of baseline awareness of that phrase. Conversely, on the next slide, you'll see that there's actually, especially when you think about how large and complex the federal government can be to the average American, the EPA is actually a fairly familiar name and a fairly clearly understood organization within the government. So 75% or so of people said they were familiar with the EPA, and 80% were actually able to correctly guess or correctly name what EPA stands for, with Environmental Protection Agency. When we asked people whether or not today, and this was before introducing any possibility of any change to the endangerment finding or any information about the endangerment finding, we simply said, overall, would you say that the US government, including the EPA, has done too much or not enough to address carbon and methane pollution specifically? Today, you see that around that a pretty solid majority of people are actually saying that the EPA, that the government is not doing enough, or is doing the right amount. There is a very small contingent of the population that is currently today saying and feeling that the EPA is doing too much. That's only about 1 in 3 Republicans even who are saying that the EPA is doing too much on greenhouse gases today. That's all by way of saying that this potential EPA change is not a response to a public mandate. This is not something that a huge swath of the public is strongly calling for. It is a fairly it's kind of the opposite. It is running somewhat countercurrent to the way that people feel about what they're expecting or hoping for from the EPA today. Next slide. We then introduced, against this backdrop, 2 different ways to talk about the EPA action. One of these spent a great deal of time explaining the endangerment finding itself. So it sort of worked through from 1 + 1 = 2 to explain to people, here's what the EPA endangerment finding is, here's what it does, here's why it's important, here's what would happen if it were revoked, right? So it's taking some time to explain to people what this finding is and what it does. We tested a different version of this where we sort of reversed the order. We didn't spend a great deal of time at all explaining what the endangerment finding was, and we simply sort of positively stated what revoking the endangerment finding would indicate about the EPA's position. So we basically framed it as this is not getting rid of the EPA, the endangerment finding, which does X, Y, Z. It's saying this is the EPA saying that they're declaring that climate change poses no threat to human life or health. So sort of an assertive, positive framing or flat framing of it that's not talking about what they're getting rid of or going through all those hoops to set up the context. And when you go to the next slide, you can see that these two versions of the explanation have a meaningful difference in how people respond to it. The first framing of it generated fairly split support of the action, kind of mixed, and a bit of presumed, I think, confusion actually in our respondents, judging by some of the open ends that we saw about what was actually happening. The second, simpler, bolder version of the explanation caused a pretty big swing, about a 12 percentage point swing in support in the direction of opposing this change, right? So it gets a little complicated because there's some double negatives in here, but basically people are around. You're shifting from support for the action towards opposing the action by around a total of 12 points if you frame it in a more direct version that really highlights the impact and the outcome and what this signifies about the EPA's proposed position on this issue, rather than taking the trip through the legal background and the setup of the actual mechanics that are involved in that position. On the next slide, the initial concern that people do voice primarily focuses either on climate impact, potential climate impact of this change when they hear about it, or on the possibility that this feels like executive overreach, that this is kind of a political agenda being imposed on what's supposed to be an administrative body with the EPA, the administration going too far, overreaching. Those tend to be the top concerns. You can see air pollution and health are also in there as initial concerns that people have when they hear about this proposed action. Next slide. Just to double click on that, I won't spend long here. I think the formatting's a little off anyway, but this is basically we combed through people's open ends using an AI classifier to kind of look for themes of the kinds of concerns that people were bringing up in their own words to explain what they were feeling or thinking when they heard about this proposed action. And we saw significantly more opposition or concern than we saw support. And once again, we saw similar themes of this is overreach. This is something that the Office of the President or that the executive branch should not be able to do. This is them going too far, and concerns about climate or environmental impact. Whereas a comparatively smaller number of people were talking about why they were glad this change was happening, and most of those hinged, or the single largest kind of theme there, hinged around the EPA not regulating this in the first place, and a little bit of a sense that maybe the scientific community has overplayed the risks here. But again, more people on the kind of opposing the potential action as opposed to supporting it. Through to the next slide. When we looked at arguments, so this was a kind of a fairly simple but useful message test to get a sense of the relative strength of different arguments. So these are, and because the double negative here of the proposed change would be removing an existing policy, it's a little convoluted, but the basic idea is these are arguments in favor of removing the endangerment finding. So the top two you can see here are we should not sacrifice prosperity, energy security, and freedoms for an agenda that handicaps industries and choice, and it's government overreach. These rules are kind of interfering with people's and businesses' lives. These were the two most effective arguments. There's a couple things to highlight. First, those sort of economic business focused arguments are more compelling than the arguments that are sort of directly tackling the science and saying that the science is overstated or the science isn't clear or going after the underpinning climate science behind the endangerment finding. I think that's really important as you think about the way this debate is going to shape up, because it so far, and from the way the data plays out, it looks like the most effective path of talking about why the EPA endangerment finding needs to go is to enlist sort of the tacit support of the business community and say that these are handcuffs and shackles on businesses. And so the EPA, if they lean into that message, is essentially enlisting businesses on their side as they talk about this, which is going to make it really important to hear from the business community to voice their actual view of the issue. because they're going to sort of be silently invoked anyway to advocate for one side. And as you'll see here, even these strongest arguments, they're about 50% favorable or rated about 50% persuasive. On the next slide, you will see that the arguments against the action are rated significantly more persuasive. So each of these is around 20 percentage points stronger in terms of the ratings that it received from participants. These are arguments arguing against the action. And you can see here the top two focus on the sort of unintended climate consequences. One of the top ones here focuses on the role that corporate oil and gas lobbyists may have played in making this change happen. And then there's one here that I really want to focus on, which is the EPA has literally one job: protect the environment. If they come out and say, do whatever you want, it will be chaos. And I think as you think about a corporate environment or a corporate messenger, that message in particular is a really powerful one. When this goes back to some of what our other speakers were highlighting around the risks of a patchwork, the sort of chaos and inconsistency and fragmentation of the framework that it could emerge if the EPA abdicates this kind of one unifying function that it is supposed to have in this space. So next slide, I'll highlight one quick thing here. This was looking at the Republicans within the split of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. You can see that those top two messages, the EPA has literally one job, and with no protections in place, the problem is going to get worse. You can see that those have 2/3 support or are rated 2/3 persuasive. 2/3 of Republicans are rating those as persuasive. So these are kind of the strong unifying top messages, regardless of party. And last on this next slide here, you can see that there was a meaningful difference, particularly with Republican respondents, when the message was framed as this is an action that President Trump is undertaking in some way. He is endangering our families to please his polluter donors. This kind of really focusing by name on the role of the president. What is one of the single least persuasive messages we tested with anyone on the Republican side? Conversely, when we tested a message that was going after this change is something oil and gas lobbyists have been asking for specifically. The EPA is supposed to work for us, not them. When you take Trump out of the equation and you focus really on the oil and gas lobbyists and their role, all of a sudden it leaps up to being one of the most persuasive messages overall, and also one of the most persuasive messages specifically for Republicans. So an interesting, a real difference in who people are likely to see or are likely to feel as the villain on this issue. The next slide pulls together. So it says at the top message, optimized message platform. This is what you would build if you went through the data and you simply pulled out what are the 3 most persuasive messages that we tested anywhere in the sample. I think for a corporate audience, those first 2 pieces, those first 3 pieces, the EPA has one job. If their new rule is to pollute as much as you want, that's opening the door completely for chaos and leaves room for very real consequences that businesses are going to have to deal with in the way that they operate and the way that they navigate a new patchwork and fragmented and inconsistent environment, where this just becomes much more complicated and difficult to operate when we used to have a single set of guiding principles that we were able to follow. And then as an added result, in addition, those consequences are going to be ones that everyday people really feel in terms of the impact of not having a single set of common sense rules around these greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to worsening air quality, rising heat, and ever worsening storms. Coming back to this idea, if there's a single phrase that kind of comes from this work, I think it is the one that the Environmental Protection Agency literally has one job, which is to protect the people and places we love. And this is an opportunity for us to remind them to do that job. The last slide here tries to summarize all these insights, and I apologize, I've gone a minute or two over my time here. Tries to pull together these different threads into a single page, just highlighting some of the most important takeaways as you're thinking about how you and your organization might approach talking about this topic.
Gosh, well, thank you so much, Will. This is fantastic. Chaos and consequences are exactly what the business community wants to avoid. I just can't thank you enough for how specific this is. And know everyone on this call, you will have a link, you will have these slides. Again, Will, just so appreciate your input. Maybe we'll stay on for a couple more minutes as we pop those questions into the Q&A, one of which one of you have asked, how do we depoliticize your engagement? And I think Will laid that out just beautifully. EPA has one job, avoiding chaos, consequences. I think it's very clear that our Republican and independent colleagues are with us. Let's go to the next slide. And I know that what you want to do next is what can you do to support our efforts? Let's go to the next slide, and that's going to take you to our letter, which we've put in the chat, our Big Tent sign-on letter, emphasis on the word big. Small, medium, large businesses and investors from across the country, 50 states, will be signing on. We expect a whole slew of signatories after this webinar, and we will update you on a regular basis as to who's on. But don't take my word for it. Let's go to the next slide, because I know who you want to hear from are two of our corporate colleagues about businesses signing on. Let me start with you, Lloyd Cass, Vice President of Strategy and Marketing Developer, Franklin Energy. Thank you so much for signing on to our letter. Lloyd, what do you have to say to your business peers about signing?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for all the information that those three amazing speakers provided. Couldn't get three better speakers. I mean, Franklin Energy, our actual purpose as a company is to boldly change our energy future, and our mission is to help all people use the world's precious resources more efficiently. So we see ourselves as turning policy ambition like that is represented by things like the endangerment finding into real world emission reductions and energy savings for individuals, for homeowners, and for in the facilities that many of the businesses on this call represent. So we're helping businesses on this call every day. So that was one of the reasons I was happy to talk about this. And so we operate about 60 different types of load management and energy efficiency programs around the country. And mainly for utilities, but also for state governments. And the endangerment finding sort of underpins a lot of the mainly state policy that drives a lot of the mandates for these programs that we deliver in the first place. So it's critically important for our business, which is one of the other reasons we signed on. But it is, I think this is like a kind of a no regrets type of thing. I mean, we didn't think, for 1 second before signing on. So yeah, sign the letter. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lloyd. So appreciate that. And now over to you, Kara Fulcher, who's here from Michelin Tire. She directs sustainability strategy there. Take it away, Kara.
Thank you, Anne. And so cognizant of the time, maybe I can kind of tie things up in a bow for us here. So, I hear the threads through the course of this hour that we've had together from all of the speakers, Gina, Michael, and Will, and they really resonate with me because, Michelin is a 135-year-old business, and we've witnessed firsthand the value that thoughtful regulation brings to society and to business. Over time, we've seen that well-crafted regulation plays a critical role in shaping responsible business practices and fostering trust among stakeholders. So we believe, and we've experienced, that regulation, when clear and consistent, serves as a vital foundation for sustainable businesses and for successful operations. And so, echoing what we've heard, let me just focus on 3 ways that we see this happening. So it simplifies engagement with stakeholders by providing clear standards, reducing the need for companies to negotiate duties and responsibilities across multiple interest groups, whether those are unions, states, municipalities, or activists. It establishes baseline expectations, minimizing the risk of a race to the bottom driven by actors who prioritize cost-cutting or short-term gain over community impact. And thirdly, it shields responsible businesses from reputational and economic fallout triggered by the actions of unprincipled neighbors. None of us wants to find our goods banned from markets because bad actors have ruined our shared reputation, as we've seen, for example, with forced labor in certain parts of the world. And so it's so much easier for business to get on with business and to winning in a competitive global marketplace when the rules are recognized, they're understood, and they're respected across stakeholders. And so if you'll bear with me for just a minute, let me put on my history buff hat for just a second and recall that it was well into the 19th century when people still talked about the United States as a plural. The United States are. And it was only as we were closing in on the 20th century that people began to shift from that fractured, multifaceted landscape to thinking of the United States as a singular form, the way we talk about the US today. The United States is. And I use this sort of academic and esoteric reference to just remind us of what an amazing boon it is to business when we have a single, consistent, continent-wide market. And surely this is something that all of us have an interest in seeing continue. And I think we really saw that brought forward in all of the arguments from the previous speakers. So just tying it all together there, I hope, in a useful way for the audience. And it's important stuff that we stay with this, this benefit that we have.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Kara, for that clear and compelling and historically significant argument. You've given us some terrific quotable quotes. I can't say anything to top that, except that all of you have something very concrete that you can do today. You'll be on the right side of history. Sign the letter. We guarantee a friendly, large, collaborative crowd. Know that we will only issue this letter publicly if we have a significant number of companies and investors. We will not expose you. We will support you in making a clean, clear economic case. Others will make the moral case around the endangerment finding. Others will make a public health case and a climate action case. We will stay in our narrow lane, but it's truly significant based on everything Kara and Lloyd and Gina and Michael and Will have just said. We need to make that case. You need to make it by standing up, signing the letter for economic certainty, for the stability of businesses, and on behalf of all the climate work you all have already done. Thanks so much for being with us today. We are here to support you, to support your public statements. We wish we had more time for question and answers. We are going to sign off now, but please reach out. We're more than happy to speak to your senior leadership about signing. We're more than happy to answer any questions that you have about the endangerment finding. And as Michael indicated, the comment period does go until mid-September. So we do have a little bit of time here. We're going to sign off now. You will get a copy, a link to this webinar and to the slides. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.